Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. Our 10th festival, like thousands of other events, was no longer able to proceed due to the rapidly evolving situation around COVID-19. While our 10th anniversary is postponed, we have 9 years of stimulating dangerous ideas in the archive to ponder, reminding us of the eerily relevant conversations that take place at the festival each year. Compassion has become a commodity whose possessions mark us as a better person, or better than other people, says Helen Razer in her Festival of Dangerous Ideas talk from 2015. In this session, writer and commentator Helen Razer diagnoses society with compassion fatigue, and the physical burnout, trauma and psychological depletion is real. This is Helen Razer with her provocation titled Against Compassion.
I'm going to be tediously honest here and tell you that I'm a little bit nervous, and not just because I forgot to pack my shapewear. So there's no spandex between you and the contours of my gut. A gut, by the way, which is full of overpriced artisanal bread, which apparently is the only kind of bread you can buy in central Sydney. And I'm also a bit nervous, not just because I feel that me being here in the company of Dr. Simon is some sort of clerical oversight, and that Fody actually wanted to book an actual grown-up who was called something like Helga Razer, but they emailed me by some sort of alphabetical accident, and they were too polite, because they are quite polite for dangerous people, to correct their mistake when I said, "Oh, yes, God, yes." Finally, I'm legitimised. So I'm nervous about these things. I do absolutely know that I'm an imposter here, and I absolutely wish that I'd remembered my Spanx. But I'm also nervous because I know that to say, particularly this week, what I'm about to say, which is that some of your most passionate and noble and deep and completely legitimate feelings may not be very useful, is a fairly unpopular position. And if I become more unpopular as a result of saying this unpopular thing, then I'll never be able to afford to replace my shapewear, which, despite the claims made by its manufacturers, does need occasional replacement, particularly after sustained abuse of bread. So if you don't enjoy this inquiry and this injury to your feelings, please remember that the person that hurt you is called Helga Razer. Helen Razer is actually a lovely, caring, compassionate lady who probably deserves a gift certificate for some high-end shapewear, particularly for when she's been eating too much bread. So anyway, between mouthfuls of bread and nervousness, I was trying to think of a way to both trash your feelings and not actually hurt them at the same time, which is, of course, impossible. So I thought what I'd do is settle instead in starting from a point on which we can probably agree, and this is all to delay sight of my big, ugly, fat point, which will be visible in a few moments from now. So I'm looking, in other words, for a sort of an intellectual Spanx to wriggle out of, and I probably haven't found it, but here goes. Here's the Spanx. So we can probably all agree on this. You all know that this is an age where we give abnormally medical names and sometimes fairly extreme medical treatment to some fairly usual human problems. So this is not to dispute that some of these medical names are quite handy and might often quite point to something real, but it is to say that medical names for everyday things can cause a bit of a muddle. Like, you know, when you say just people who are quite reasonably sad because a terrible thing happened to them become depressed, or people who are bored because a really boring thing happened to them have ADHD, or people who are full of bread because they crammed their own nervous fat faces with it all morning are gluten intolerant. That's a thing. They're gluten intolerant, or they've got BED, binge eating disorder, which is a thing, apparently. It's a real thing, BED. And it's in the new revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And if you look it up, what happens if you eat past the point where you feel full once a week, you don't just have a pizza loyalty card, what you actually have is a disease. So this is what the system of what they call medicalisation brings us. It takes quite understandable biological or psychological or social responses into an institutional understanding. And this sort of stuff, you know, these big names for everyday things is not just applied by health professionals, but by large numbers of us. We're not just full of bread, but we're gluten intolerant. A child doesn't just have a perfectly reasonable revulsion for school, which is a horrible fucking place, but has sensory processing disorder. Which I'm sure is a real thing if your child's got it. That was Helen Razer saying that mean thing. We don't just like to have sex with lots of different people, but we're love addicts. So usual things that we could probably explain by recourse to basic biology or logic or our flaws or the flaws of the world, they acquire this medical dimension. And this can be quite funny when you hear nice white middle-class persons, a group very well represented here, including my foul self. So I talk about that, you know, they have dissociative online shopping disorder or something like that. And that's quite funny, but it can also be quite serious and quite irritating when it gets to the point, as it often does, where we can look at a group of people whose problems are obviously social and say that they're medical. So, for example, we say that Indigenous Australians are many, many times more likely to be afflicted with depression. And that might be true. But what this medical shapewear habit does is transform the truth at the core of that proposition, which is that Indigenous Australians are many, many times more likely than non-Indigenous Australians to be impoverished, incarcerated and subject to a range of institutional abuses. So even though you might make the connection or other people might make the connection between social poverty and what we call depressive disorder, it is at both a practical and a policy level quite unhelpful to say that the problem with Indigenous Australians is that they're depressed, when the problem is clearly with a range of institutions, like who has the illness here. So what we have in some of these medicalised cases is not just an aggrandisement of the trivial, like binge eating disorder, you know, I've got a pizza card, but a trivialisation of very grand and serious problems, like saying that an Indigenous Australian person is not actually just responding in a perfectly reasonable way to unreasonable conditions, but is sick. So we say this person has a disease and it's not a system of social organisation that is sick. That's what the medical category of depression in particular can do in this case. So we take a public or a social problem and we make it the property of a private individual. And it's this kind of powerful organisational thinking that allows us to come up with a phrase that you've probably already heard, which is compassion fatigue, considered by many people to be a legitimate illness. It is, honestly, no, it is. Compassion fatigue is or has been at times considered a real thing. And like a lot of quasi-medical disorders, it probably has some usefulness as a category. It was initially used to describe nurses, ER nurses, who were subject to trauma at an abnormally high rate, and they were experiencing physical burnout and other kinds of emotional and psychological depletion. So people who work or live in intense environments like police officers or emergency workers or people who are carers, they find themselves dissociating and less than capable of experiencing everyday connection with people. So it's probably a good thing to give this a name and recognise this problem, particularly in the context of labour, so you can work out ways to avoid its onset, perhaps. Just like it would be a good thing to avoid the onset of depression, where it more often occurs, which is in very particular social groups, who, in unsurprising news, as I just said, tend to really suffer inequality rather than they suffer depression. So these mass categories can be useful. I don't want to trash them completely in some policy contexts, but they can tend to locate a particular problem within an individual. So what you risk here by using this institutional language or saying in saying this person has failed to be well, that doesn't allow you to also say the situation that produced these symptoms is unwell, and it makes a public illness a private concern. So I think this sort of stuff is part of necessarily part of a problem with big institutions and the policy surrounding them. Mass medical institutions aren't perfect, and they can't ever be perfect. But a sure way to make them less than perfect or actually dysfunctional is to uphold this idea that fixing the inevitable symptoms of a society with many problems is the responsibility of medical science. It's like large numbers of people are force-fed poison, and the solution is rarely to stop feeding them poison, but to say that they have poison imbibing disorder. And while I said, as I said, it can be useful to describe a collection of symptoms in the terms of a disease, shorthand, the problem of understanding things as private diseases or private responses is very widespread. We have taken many, many cues from the medical establishment, and of course we've started to enthusiastically adopt its language and the thinking of mass institutions. And often we find to use institutional language actually liberating. We often find it, somebody says, oh, well, you have depression, and you think, oh, thank goodness, It's happened to me too. Oh, that's all right, I have a disease. And we actually find it freeing sometimes to give ourselves a medical name. We feel it gives us power to have problems that we're told are private but are actually very public in origin. So depression is made private when, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, it's a public problem. So I don't think that anything that I've said is terribly surprising, and that was my intention. We make jokes about this stuff all the time. We all find the idea of a society full of diseased people who find elaborate names for typical problems actually quite funny, except when it's not funny and it's just desperately sad. But I want you to sort of keep that idea of a person who has a publicly created problem, which is made private, in mind when I begin to hurt your feelings. And I also want you to keep in mind how many of us have heard the phrase compassion fatigue and perhaps even identified with it, perhaps even this week, just like we might have identified with the phrase depression. So compassion fatigue, and it is considered by many practitioners a legitimate disease. It's one of those many diseases that come to us from a medical context and is adopted by popular discourse. And yes, it may describe a real set of symptoms. I'm not saying that it's not useful, especially in a medical context. And I'm not even saying that it's not useful in a global communications context, which is where the idea really became popularised, because people really are genuinely traumatised by things that they see via media. People are traumatised by the things that they see, and even if these are not directly seen in an emergency room and we're exposed to them via television or the internet, the sense of desperation we feel, which may be followed by an emotional shutdown, is actually real. That's real. Your feelings are real. They're stupid, but they're real. So it's a thing that really, really happens. It happens to all of us, even happens to me, and I'm part Vulcan. And what this might do in our own lives is make us less productive at work. Oh, God, no. But what people will also say is that compassion fatigue will make us less productive as meaningful private citizens. Compassion fatigue is actually considered a real problem. So whether you're talking about compassion fatigue, which is a flowery, diseasified way that suggests that you did have compassion but it was taken from you, or what some writers are now calling narcissism, which means that you might never have had compassion in the first place, the absence of compassion in the individual is seen as a real problem. And there are some thinkers like Anne Mann, whose book The Life Vi is good, even though there's a few problems I have with, but I'm in the business of finding problems. And she was advancing a more complex view and saying that compassion was actually taken from us by contemporary life. So even though people like the very scholarly, very, very bright man are still diagnosing a disease, narcissism, not compassion fatigue, basically the same thing, she was at least saying that the disease has social origins. And we've all heard this sort of thing, or maybe even thought or spoken this sort of thing, like contemporary life makes us very selfish, you know. So I think there is obviously a good argument to make that contemporary life does make us selfish. And I agree with Mann's idea that narcissism is a necessary byproduct of growth capitalism, and that to believe that you are special and the master of your own destiny and that anyone who has less than you is undeserving is what is going to happen when we participate in the terms of this economic base. This is all, you know, pretty unchallenging stuff for your average socialist. I hope there's some of us here this afternoon, or even you wussy progressive liberals. We could probably all agree that the conditions of production make us into particular kinds of people. The nature of exchange determines our character. The character of the market becomes our character. It has to be to allow the market to survive. So I believe that we do, and a Marxist would probably believe that we do, to have compassion fatigue or narcissism or whatever you want to call this individually focused thing that we have. But what I don't believe is that the restoration of that compassion, like we ever had any, is the answer. Because if what we call a lack of compassion is the result of the relations produced by the economic base, then we don't fix anything until we fix the base. It's like saying that we have poison imbibing disorder and letting us drink the poison over and over again. It's demanding that we change our symptoms, our lack of compassion, and hoping quite illogically that the absence of symptoms will also cure the disease. So I'm getting closer to the part where I'm going to hurt your feelings. I'm taking off the Spanx. It is very, very, very usual for people to say that the biggest problem in the world is that people just don't care. I see calls for compassion all the time on my Facebook feed. I see newspaper articles chiding government agencies for their lack of compassion, as though government agencies ever had a face or a character. I see President Obama twice already this year at the UN had a little break on dropping drones on kiddies in the Yemen and said that compassion was needed. Why have a UN then if all you need is compassion? So it's easy to think that compassion is what is needed, and it's very easy to call some Spanxless bread-filled woman who says that it is not the main thing that is needed a cruel neocon sourdough scoffing daughter of Ayn Rand. You can probably do that. You might be doing that on Twitter right now. It's very, very tempting for all of us to think that if only we cared more, that the world would be transformed. It's also very easy in a private emotional context to do it. And I know in private or semi-private contexts, we've all suffered or witnessed a lack of compassion and be hurt. And that'll never change. And that's usual, nothing wrong with that. And then we sort of extrude that private experience and we transpose it on the public realm. And we think, if only there was more compassion, then that terrible thing over there, over the other side of the world that I saw on the Guardian website would not happen if only we had more compassion. A really clear example here of how people believe that is on discussion on the policy surrounding asylum seekers. Now, just to be very clear, this policy is something I consider to be abhorrent, insane, expensive, improper, and actually completely unnecessary. But what I don't think is that compassion is going to provide a solution to it, because there's actually no shortage of compassion surrounding this conversation at all. There's no shortage of compassion surrounding the conditions that produce the policy. And when Tony Abbott, a man who is very much ruled in policy by his deep emotions, he is. He says that the most compassionate thing we can do is stop the boats. And I think we have to allow that he actually really means that. I do. I have a lot of unflattering things to say about the policies of Tony Abbott, but I think as a policymaker he's awful. But as a compassionate person, he actually scores pretty well. He lacks a lot, including a healthy economy. But what he doesn't want for is compassion. Now, there's not much that's surprising about your first visit to the press gallery at Parliament House. You see Laurie and you see Michelle, and then you see all these babies who are going to be Laurie and Michelle one day. And all of these people in the gallery, they're journalists, so they're cynical by default. But where you get the surprise is when you actually start meeting politicians. And the surprise is their absence of cynicism. The big surprise in Canberra is that it is populated by powerful people who care. I don't mean to suggest that politicians are incorruptible, or that they're not driven by ambition or capital or bad ideas or terrible staff or external interests, or that they are delightful Pollyannas to whom the very thought of, say, taking a helicopter to a golf club or a credit card to a lap dance establishment would never occur. Of course, they are often bad people because they are people, but they are actually genuinely very full of compassion. I'm not asking you to admire them, because I'm actually not asking you to admire compassion. I'm not asking you to admire it in yourself or anybody else. But I do want you to entertain the possibility that people in positions of great power often care a lot, and particularly in the field of politics. You simply can't continue to go to work every day if you don't believe that what you're doing is the right and the proper and the civic-minded and the compassionate thing. So on the matter of asylum, I've seen several politicians actually and possibly legitimately shed tears. I saw Tony Burke in late July weep at the ALP National Conference's Chapter 9 amendments when he said that what he needed to recommend was that the ALP uphold a turn-back policy. He cried. I think they were real tears. Like the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Government, he believes that the most compassionate act is to stop deaths at sea. You actually can't question this compassion. You can go on believing if it's fake if you want, although I don't happen to think that it is. I don't think it's counterfeit, and I continue to believe that politicians care, even and often quite especially the ones with whom I happen to vehemently disagree. And even though you can choose to believe that Tony Burke was bunging it on, and certainly a lot of people there did, and that true compassion would lead him to a better solution, I want you to consider the words of the backbencher that day, Andrew Giles, who spoke against the turn-back policy. And he said, none of us has a monopoly on compassion. So, in other words, he's saying compassion is not a question. Don't ask that question. It's no more than a question that it is an answer. But what it has become, particularly in the case of asylum seeker policy, is for me anyway, a real embarrassment. We have one group of people saying stop the boats and another saying let them all come. And I would argue that both these slogans point to impossible and unethical solutions. And we have a country of commentators who are all invested chiefly in the fact of their own compassion. You simply can't keep charging the side on which you are not with a lack of compassion, as though compassion were the only question, the only answer, and the actual prize. I've heard the word compassion used so often in this debate, I wonder if it's not actually a kind of mission creep. The issue of compassion has become central here, more important than visas. Who has it and who doesn't have it seems to be what it's all about. Compassion is nothing like a visa. It's no guarantee of anything. It's not a guarantee of good policy. They have compassion. What they don't have is policy. It's a guarantee only in public life of a prolonged, if unintentional, display only of itself. And I would say that even if it doesn't become depleted, which is what our friends in the medical science would say, it happens when you get compassion fatigue, it can actually tend to immobilise those who have it. On a personal level, just with, the real life inevitable compassion that you're going to feel, it can be paralysing because, a stream of emotional stimulus makes us consistently emotional. And in the case of asylum seekers, it makes us not in top form to advocate for whatever side we choose. On a public level, it becomes an exercise in just exponential display of itself. Either way, we become paralysed in not just the emotion itself, but the requirement to actually show it. I want to remind you that I believe that your compassion is real. I believe any tears that you shed this week were absolutely real. I don't doubt your compassion. The only thing that I doubt is its effectiveness. Having said this, there was a really good example just last week of what we could call fake or conspicuous compassion. The Saturday before this one, you all know Daffodil Day, right? The annual Daffodil Day. You know this? So it's the Cancer Council's major annual public fundraiser, and you buy a flower or you buy a plastic replica of a flower from a representative, and this money goes to what we must presume to be a worthy cause. I know lots of people have very credible problems with different kinds of cancer fundraising, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that this is a good cause and that giving money to the Cancer Council is a good thing to do. All questions about that organisation or the nature of charity itself aside. So usually the Cancer Council has gone with a fairly flowery approach in its promotions, and this to date has worked quite well for them. They play some music by Coldplay or something equally minstrel, and we all feel a jolt of compassion and we open our wallets. It's just the Cancer Council has previously just asked us to care and to show compassion. This year, though, the promotion was different and quite aggressive, and actually more of an echo of what we might expect at the hands of the people we now call charity muggers. Those people at the train station who ask you for money, and when you say, oh, no, sorry, I haven't got any, they say, are you even human? OMFG. And they sort of bully you into that. So the promotion this year was quite different for the Cancer Council. It was show you care about beating cancer. It didn't say care about beating cancer. It didn't even say beat cancer. It was just show you care about beating cancer. It wasn't about acting from goodwill, which would be, for you philosophy nerds, what Immanuel Kant would want. And it wouldn't be about acting toward good consequences, which for you other half of philosophy nerds is what Peter Singer would want. No recognisable ethics here. It just said show you care about beating cancer, which is interesting because it out and out says appear compassionate. Now, I don't think there's anything actually particularly wrong with the Cancer Council doing this, because it's only the job of the Cancer Council to get money. That's with this promotion. That's their only job. It's not their job to be ethical outside their own remit. And if their advertising advisor says that this works, then that's okay. It's only their job to get my money. It's not their job to babysit my ethics. It's the job for Peter and Emmanuel. What's interesting here is that it indicates that compassion is now something that we know we need to display. It is something that actually has a value. So to get back to the earlier rambling when I still had my theoretical Spanx on, let me remind you about how better thinkers on narcissism, which is the absence of compassion, say that society turns us into hard people and we must resist this toughness if we ever want things to improve. Now, I also want you to think about what I was saying before about how fixing this system, this lack of compassion, is not going to change the base, not going to change the cause, which is to say we live in an era, again, where the economic base, which places us in a competitive environment, produces this non-compassionate outcome. So to be very clear about it, fixing the symptom is not going to fix the origin of the problem. I also want you to think about how compassion has been seen in the Cancer Council ad as something that actually has a visible economic value. Compassion itself has become an item, a commodity, whose possession marks us as a better person, better than other people, presumably. So if compassion is seen as not only something that can be exchanged for money, that has a monetary value, but as something that places us in competition with people who don't have it, so, it has a fetish value as well, then maybe compassion could be said to be part of the problem. The economic competitive problem, it echoes that. It's not the solution. I'm not by any means recommending that you divest yourself of compassion for revolutionary purposes. I don't think you could avoid it anyway. Caring for others is an unsolvable problem. And if there's anything we can say about being human, it's that we tend to this tiresome work, if not otherwise raised in the forest by wolves or charity muggers. You're going to feel compassion whenever it's ineluctable for you, even as it is for a neoconservative politician. And it is politically useless and paralysing to you, even as it is for a neoconservative politician. Doesn't mean you shouldn't feel it. Pointless injunction, you're going to feel it anyway, damn it. But it does mean that just because it feels powerful, it's not necessarily powerful. And just because it feels selfless and transporting, and it really does, and who amongst us can genuinely say that we've not been personally moved by just how much we've been personally moved? It's just fucking useless. It's inevitable and it's intoxicating, but this doesn't mean that it'll lead you or anyone else anywhere of any value. One of my least favourite monsters of history is Mother Teresa. Total compassionate bitch. Let's set aside that she had some very weird interpretations of Christian love and a spiritual fondness for suffering that saw many of the people seeking care at her ministry get nothing but applause for sharing the passion of the Christ. Yeah, that'll fix your leprosy, won't it? Let's even overlook the fact that she was a batty theocrat that let her patients endure pain when she, in receipt of many funds, could have easily given them medical care. Let's just pretend that she was the marvellous person that even many secular people presume her to be, and look at one of her most famous statements, which is, never worry about numbers, help one person at a time, and always start with the person nearest you, which would be you, Simon. Now, I imagine what Simon needs right now is probably a good strong coffee to help him endure the end of my talk. But if I would worry less about the numbers than the one person nearest me, a larger number of you than was already predicted would be asking for your money back because you'd be here with nothing to do for 15 minutes as I popped off to get Simon a macchiato, is it? I think you're a macchiato man. And I'd never get to finish this marvellous chat and you probably all go home cross saying that Helen Razer really needs to lay off the bread and get herself some shapewear. So anyway, Mother Teresa, monstrous Teresa, already been reviled by many activist atheists. Oh, God, those people. But anyway, it might seem extreme to use her as an example of what we think about compassion, and it could seem to you that using this compassionate example of monstrous Teresa is a category error. I actually don't think so, because I think this don't look at the numbers stuff is absolutely key to compassion. I think compassion, inevitable as it is on all scales, has been so overvalued. Remember, you can buy it and you need to have it to look better than other people. It's been so overvalued, even by the very economy that some people say robs us of it, that we've begun to think of it as the basis for meaningful social change. The terrible thing about wonderful compassion is that it demands an object. It demands a photograph of a drowning child, or the sight of a suffering person, or the thought of death endured by cancer or by negligent nuns. Compassion has an appetite, and like anything that needs feeding, including myself, it can't always be trusted to lead. What if compassion takes you to a trough full of visible suffering, the people nearest you? What are you missing along the way? It's an act, I believe, of belligerent and selfish faith for me to trust my compassion. I'm not control of the things that incite it in me. And what do I miss when I'm led by my snout to the juiciest morsel of sadness? Do I miss the fact that the clothes on my back were made by Bangladeshi textile workers and wrapped by UK packers from materials exchanged for petrodollars that reassert the power of the US hegemon that prompts death and confusion in Syria and ends up drowning small children? Do I remember that my smartphone, whose map function is leading me to what I'm sure is the true source of compassion, was made in a Chinese labour camp by people who haven't seen their family in months or slept in days but are doing a lot better than the people in Central Africa or Indonesia who mine the elements in my phone that get me to my compassionate date on time? And if I stop to bear all of this compassionate weight and manage not to become an object for somebody else's, because by now I'm on a fucking Zoloft drip feed, could I possibly make myself feel better by knowing that the company that made this phone, which, let's be honest, is full of about 17 other people's blood, has a human rights division? Oh, they do. It's currently promoting same-sex marriage rights. Should I feel compassion for those people who are currently unable to convince the state to give them a certificate and legitimacy? And if I do, am I forgetting the real victims of homophobia here? You know, the ones who are never going to get to be the CEO of Apple or even care about getting married because their life is not fucking suitable for a moving YouTube video about love, love, love. What about the rent boys? What about the people for whom things can't get better? What about all the places in the world where hope is a long, long way from ever being restored? Do I just count on my compassion to lead me there? And the idea that if I'm nice and caring to certain people, particularly Tim Cook, oh, he seems nice, then this love will trickle down and help everybody. Well, you know, wealth doesn't trickle down. I think, you know, Tariq Ali and other people, Naomi Klein, are doing a good job of convincing us of that. Wealth doesn't trickle down, and neither do the good vibes of compassion. If you believe that your love is powerful enough to change the world, you're just as deluded as monstrous Teresa. If you believe that it is possible for you to become aware of every being in every situation who is worthy of your compassion, you're as deluded about the scope of your intelligence as Tony Abbott. If you believe that Apple makes up for its labour practice with a few kind words about monogamous, successful gay people, you are as rich in naivety as Tim Cook is in stock options. You cannot know if your compassion is earned. You cannot know if your compassion is ethical. But you can know this: it paralyses you in a system that doesn't produce inequality because of a lack of compassion. In fact, compassion is one of the ways in which we conceal the system itself. You must begin to see that you cannot ever begin to see even a fraction of the pain in the world. Violence may not be happening to the person nearest you, and even if it is, you may not be able to see it. How can you see the slow, boring violence that robs some workers of their bodies over years? How can you trace the fast, unimaginable violence that robs some people of their lives and their breath across the other side of the world? How can I get a Simon a coffee when I'm on some purple revolutionary tear? You have to look at the numbers, despite what monstrous Teresa said, and not just the person nearest you or to the picture of their drowning or the movie of their life. And actually, you don't even have to look at the numbers. You just need to look at the formula that contains them, that sees these same numbers, these same people, these same individuals land in the same terrible place over and over again. Compassion is asking for the impossible. It asks us for capitalism with a human face. We can keep demanding this false and moral appearance from a bunch of numbers. That's all capitalism is. We can ask capital to civilise itself and put itself into some lovely Spanx. But capitalism is not listening because it can't hear you. You can't implore a formula to do something, and you can't expect compassion to be half as good at transformation as a new set of equations. Brothers and sisters, thank you very much.
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House and presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website.